One last at bat. The story of Jacob Landis. Philadelphia, 1938. Chapter 1. The long road back to Broad Street. The bus smelled of cigarette smoke and axle grease, and Jacob Landis had been riding it for 14 hours. He sat with his hat tilted over his eyes, and his spikes stuffed in the bag between his feet, listening to the Pennsylvania countryside roll past in the dark. Every mile brought him closer to Philadelphia, and every mile made his left knee ache a little more, a souvenir from a slide into third base in Chattanooga back in 1931 that had never quite healed right. Jacob was 34 years old, which in baseball years put him somewhere between veteran and antique. He had spent the better part of a decade moving through the minor leagues like a man perpetually on the verge of something always good enough to stay, never quite brilliant enough to be called up for good. He had played for teams in Reading, Birmingham, Newark, and Albany. He had slept in rooming houses that charged by the week and eaten ham sandwiches from wax paper on more bus rides than he could count. But now he was going home, or at least home adjacent. He had received a letter 3 days ago from Eddie Collins, the general manager of the Philadelphia Athletics, inviting him to spring training camp as a non-roster invitee. It was not a contract. It was not a promise. It was barely even a sentence, a single paragraph typed on official letterhead, signed in blue ink. But Jacob had read it 11 times on the bus and could recite it from memory. "We'd like to have a look at you, Landis. Report to Shibe Park by the 15th. Don't be late. Don't be late." He almost laughed every time he got to that part. He had been waiting 7 years for this letter. He was not going to be late. Jacob pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window. Outside, the lights of Philadelphia began to bleed into the horizon, the familiar amber glow of a city waking up before the world was fully ready. He had been born 4 miles from Shibe Park, on a row house street in Kensington where every family either worked the mills or followed the athletics. His father had taken him to see Lefty Grove pitch in 1929. Jacob had been 15, and from the moment he had stood in the upper deck and looked out at that emerald field framed in concrete and blue sky, he had known with a certainty that bordered on religious conviction what his life was supposed to be. He just had not counted on it taking quite this long. He took a room at a boarding house on Lehigh Avenue, 2 blocks from the ballpark. The landlady, Mrs. Ostrowski, was a broad-shouldered Polish woman who fed her boarders without being asked and charged a fair rate without being negotiated down. She looked Jacob over when he arrived at 6 in the morning with his bag over his shoulder. "You a ball player?" she asked. "Trying to be?" he said. She nodded as if this were a satisfactory answer, and showed him to a small room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out at the park's back wall. He could see the light towers. He set his bag on the bed, sat down beside it, and stared at those towers until the morning light turned them gold. Chapter 2. Shibe Park. First morning. Spring training in Philadelphia in 1938 meant cold air and skeptical coaches. The Athletics were not a great team. They had not been since the dynasty years of the early 30s, when Connie Mack had built one of the finest rosters in the history of the game and then, almost incomprehensibly, sold it off piece by piece to keep the club solvent. What remained was a team held together with young prospects, aging veterans, and the quiet dignity of Connie Mack himself, who at 75 still managed the club from the dugout in his suit and tie and straw boater. Jacob arrived at Shibe Park at 7 in the morning, an hour before anyone had told him to be there. He stood at the players' entrance on Somerset Street and breathed in the smell of cut grass and linseed oil and something else, something he could only call history that seeped out from between the bricks of the old ballpark. He changed in the locker room among men 10 years his junior, who moved with the easy confidence of youth and eyed him with polite curiosity. A few nodded. Nobody asked his name. He was a non-roster invitee, which was essentially baseball's way of saying, "You're here as a favor, but don't get comfortable." The field was breathtaking. He had seen it before, from the stands, but standing on the grass, the actual grass, wearing an athletics uniform, even if it was just a camp jersey, something tightened in his chest that had nothing to do with his knee. He found an open batting cage and began to take cuts. His swing was still clean, always had been his best attribute. A compact, level stroke that kept the ball in play. He was not a power hitter, never had been, but he could handle the bat with a craftsman's precision, spray the ball to all fields, move a runner over, Put the ball on the ground when the situation called for it. Small ball, they called it. Old-fashioned ball, the young coaches said, not entirely as a compliment. You've got the prettiest swing of any man in this cage, said a voice behind him, and the slowest feet I've seen since my grandmother tried to run for the trolley. Jacob turned. A short, barrel-chested man in a coach's uniform leaned against the cage netting, arms folded, eyes crinkling with what might have been amusement or might have been contempt. His name, Jacob would learn, was Roy Farrell, third base coach, and the man who had, for reasons Jacob could not yet fathom, put his name on the invitation list in the first place. Jacob Landis, Jacob said, extending a hand. I know who you are, Farrell said, shaking it. I saw you play for Newark in '34. You hit .317 that year. Outfielder tried to throw you out at second, and you beat him by 2 steps. My knee was better then. Farrell studied him without expression. Show me what you've got. We'll figure out the rest. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of Jacob's professional life, which was saying something. He ran drills in the cold morning air until his breath came in white clouds, and his knee screamed at him on every plant step. He took hundreds of ground balls at second base, the position he had played since his 20s, moving laterally with the careful economy of a man who could not afford to be reckless with his body. He hit off live pitching every afternoon, timing his swing to the younger arms, finding the rhythm the same way he always had, by going quiet inside and letting the ball come to him. He was not the best player in camp. He knew that. There were kids here who could run like deer and had arms like cannons. Jacob brought something different to the field. He brought the long memory of a man who had studied this game for 2 decades and learned its every turn and feint. He knew which pitchers tipped their curve by the angle of their glove. He knew how to read the infield shift before it fully formed. He knew, instinctively, exactly where the ball was going to be, even when his legs could no longer guarantee he would beat it there. Whether that was enough remained to be seen. Chapter 3. The Landis household, Kensington. On Sunday afternoons, Jacob walked 4 miles to his mother's row house on Emerald Street, the same house where he had grown up, where his father had died of a heart attack in 1933, and where his mother, Clara Landis, still kept a picture of Jake's first Little League team on the mantelpiece beside a ceramic figurine of the Virgin Mary and a small American flag. Clara Landis was 61 years old and moved through her kitchen with the brisk authority of a woman who had raised 4 children on a factory worker's wages and considered sentimentality a luxury she could not afford. But every Sunday when Jacob came, she made his favorite stuffed cabbage with rye bread, and she always had a glass of cold water on the table before he had even set down his hat. You look thin, she said the first Sunday. I'm training, Ma. Thin is thin. She set the plate in front of him. Your brother called. He says to remind you there are jobs at the post office if this doesn't work out. Tell Eddie I'll keep it in mind. She sat across from him and folded her hands around her coffee cup. Clara Landis had never been a particularly effusive woman, but Jacob had always been able to read her silences like a text. This one said, I am proud of you and I am terrified for you and I will not say either thing out loud. Your father used to talk about Shebe Park like it was the Vatican, she said finally. I know. He would have liked this. She said it simply, the way you state a fact, and went back to her coffee. Jacob ate his stuffed cabbage and did not say anything for a while. Outside, the Kensington streets were quiet in the Sunday way, the mills dark, kids on stoops, someone's radio playing a hymn through a window screen. This was the city he knew better than any other, the city he had left at 19 to chase a dream through every minor league outpost from here to the Gulf Coast. And something about sitting in this kitchen made the whole improbable journey feel both longer and shorter than it actually was. I'm going to make the team, he said. Clara looked up. Of course you are, she said, as if the question had never been open. What Jacob did not tell his mother, what he had not told anyone, was that he had overheard a conversation in the coach's office the previous Thursday. He had not meant to eavesdrop. He had stopped to tie his shoe in the corridor when Roy Farrell's voice came through the thin wall, talking to someone Jacob did not recognize. Landis is a hell of a baseball man, Farrell was saying. Knows the game better than anyone in this camp. But Mac wants youth. He wants building blocks. Landis is 34 and his knee's not right. Even if we keep him on the roster, he sits the bench all year. A pause. Then the other voice. So we cut him. Farrell was quiet for a moment. Give him the rest of camp. He deserves that much. Jacob had finished tying his shoe, stood up, and walked very quietly back to the locker room. He had sat on the bench in front of his locker for a long time, listening to the distant sound of batting practice, the crack of the ball, the chatter of young men who had their whole careers ahead of them. He did not feel sorry for himself. He had been around baseball too long for that. What he felt was something more specific and more particular. He wanted one game, not a career, not a contract. Just one game in a Philadelphia Athletics uniform, on this field, in front of this crowd, in the city where his father had taught him to love this sport. One game to be able to say to his mother, to his father's memory, to himself that he had been here, that it had been real. He just had to find a way to make it happen before camp ended. Chapter 4. What Connie Mack Saw. Cornelius McGillicuddy Connie Mack had been managing baseball teams since 1894. He was, by 1938, something between a living legend and a national monument. A tall, angular man who sat in the dugout like a grandfather at the end of a long Sunday and missed nothing. He was famous for communicating with his players not by shouting, but by the quiet repositioning of a scorecard held in one thin hand, a language only those who had played for him long enough learned to read. Jacob had been aware of Mack watching him during drills, in the particular way that veteran players learn to sense observation without looking directly at it. Mack said nothing. He wrote in his notebook. He watched. It was during an intra-squad game in the second week of camp that something shifted. The Athletics were playing a controlled scrimmage first stringers against the non-roster group, and Jacob was playing second base for the B side. The score was tied in the seventh inning when the leadoff man singled, and the next batter hit what appeared to be a sure, double play ball, a sharp grounder to the second base side. Jacob went to his right, fielded it cleanly on a short hop, and in the same motion without hesitating, without checking, flipped the ball to the shortstop covering second, who pivoted and gunned it to first for the double play. It was not a spectacular play. A younger player might have made it faster, but the decision had been instant and correct, the execution smooth, the timing perfect. It was the play of a man who had made it so many thousands of times that his body knew what to do before his mind had finished the question. In the dugout, Connie Mack made a small mark in his notebook. On the last Friday of camp, with roster decisions due the following Monday, Jacob was called into Mack's office. It was a spare room, a desk, 2 chairs, a window looking out at the infield, framed photographs of old teams, a smell of pipe tobacco. Mack sat behind the desk with his hands folded. He was wearing his street clothes and his collar was buttoned to the top, as always. He gestured at the chair across from him. "Sit down, son." Jacob sat. He kept his hands flat on his thighs. "You've had a good camp," Mack said. He had a precise, unhurried way of speaking, each word placed like a careful bid. "Better than I expected, if I'm honest. You can still play." "Yes, sir." "Your knee concerns me." "It's manageable." Mack studied him. "I've managed ball clubs for 44 years. I've seen men play hurt, and I've seen men play through hurt, and those are 2 different things. You play through it. I can see that. What I can't tell is how many more games it's got in it." Jacob said nothing. He had learned, at 34, that sometimes the most important thing you could say was nothing. "I've been watching you since the first day," Mack said. "You're not just a ball player, you're a baseball man. There's a difference." "I know the difference," Jacob said. "Yes." Mack unfolded his hands and pressed them flat on the desk. "I understand you grew up here. Kensington." "Yes, sir. 4 miles from this park." Something moved across Mack's face, not quite sentiment, but its dignified cousin. He picked up his pen. "Roy tells me you've never played a regular season major league game." "That's correct." "Why'd you keep going? After all these years?" Jacob thought about the question for a real moment. Outside the window, the groundskeeper was dragging the infield. The late afternoon light was coming through at a long angle, turning the dirt gold. "My father brought me here when I was 15, he said. Lefty Grove pitched. "I decided that day that I was going to play on that field someday. I've never had a good enough reason to stop believing that." Mack was quiet. He wrote something on a piece of paper, folded it, and set it aside. Then he looked up. "Go get some rest," he said. "We'll talk Monday." Chapter 5. The longest weekend. Saturday passed the way terrible waiting always does, in slow, grinding minutes that accumulated without mercy. Jacob ran through his routine. Light stretching, a walk around the neighborhood, Sunday supper at his mother's. He did not tell Clara about the meeting with Mac. He did not tell her about the conversation he had overheard either. He ate his stuffed cabbage and helped her wash the dishes, and walked home under the spring stars feeling simultaneously like a boy of 15 and an old man. On Sunday night he could not sleep. He lay on the narrow bed in Mrs. Ostrowski's boarding house, listening to the city and thinking about the particular thing that baseball took from you when you let it. Years. It took years from you and gave you something back that was harder to name. Not wisdom exactly, not toughness exactly, but some alloy of the two, a quality that had no word in English, but that you recognized instantly in the face of any man who had played the game long enough to lose his illusions and kept playing anyway. He thought about all the bus rides, all the rooming houses, the double headers in August heat, the spring games in the frozen mud of upstate New York, the night games in Birmingham where the moths circled the light towers like small white planets. He thought about every manager who had told him he was a fine player, a real professional, a credit to the organization, and then optioned him down. He thought about the year he had hit .332 in Newark and waited all summer for a call that never came. He did not regret any of it. That was the thing he had figured out somewhere around his 30th birthday. The journey itself had been real. The games had mattered. The craft had been genuine. No roster decision could retroactively hollow out what he had actually done out there on those fields across America, in front of crowds that ranged from thousands to dozens. But oh, just once. Just one game in front of this city, in this park, in this uniform. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Monday morning, he rose at 5 and went out to sit on the front stoop in the dark. The street lamps were still lit. A milk truck clattered down Lehigh Avenue. Somewhere a dog barked twice and stopped. He sat with his hands around a mug of coffee and watched the sky go from black to purple to gray to the particular pale blue of a Philadelphia April morning. He was thinking about nothing and everything when Mrs. Ostrowski came to the door behind him in her housecoat. "Telephone for you," she said. "Man says it's from the Athletics." Jacob set down his coffee very carefully. He stood up, smoothed his jacket, and went inside. Chapter 6. The call. Roy Farrell's voice on the telephone was brisk and businesslike, which told Jacob nothing. "Get to the park by 9, Farrell said. "Mr. Mack wants to speak to you before he speaks to the rest of the roster." "Is that good or bad?" Jacob asked. A pause. "Just be there at 9, Landis." He was there at 8:15. He sat in the empty dugout and looked out at the field, the way the morning light moved across the outfield grass, the way the chalk lines of the batter's box had been freshly drawn for the day's practice. He watched the groundskeeper work the infield with an easy, practiced motion, and felt, without quite being able to say why, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. At 9 o'clock sharp, Roy Farrell appeared at the dugout steps. "He'll see you." Mac was standing when Jacob entered the office this time, which seemed significant. He was looking out the window at the infield with his hands clasped behind his back. "Close the door," he said, without turning. Jacob closed it. "I have a roster problem," Mac said, still facing the window. "Bobby McCabe, my backup second baseman, has a broken finger. He'll be out 6 to 8 weeks." He finally turned. "I need a man who can play second base, handle himself professionally, know the situations, and not embarrass the organization." Jacob felt something happening in his chest that he was determined not to show on his face. "I'm not asking you to be a star," Mac continued. "I'm asking you to be a professional. Can you do that?" "Mr. Mac," Jacob said, "I've been doing that for 15 years. Mac allowed himself a small, precise smile. It lasted about a second and a half. 6 weeks, he said. "Maybe 8. We'll see how your knee holds up. The pay will be the league minimum." He held out his hand. "Welcome to the Philadelphia Athletics." Jacob shook his hand. His grip was steady. His voice, when he thanked him, was steady. He held it all together until he was back in the corridor, and then he stood with his back against the wall and pressed his eyes closed for about 10 seconds and let himself feel it, the full weight of the thing, all the years of it, and then he opened his eyes, put his hat back on, and went to find his locker. Chapter 7. Opening week, a game approaches. The regular season began on April 18th, a Tuesday, with a home opener against the Boston Red Sox. Philadelphia was the kind of city that came out for its teams, even when those teams were not very good, and by game time, Shibe Park was three-quarters full, maybe 18,000 people filling the stands with a sound that Jacob heard from the outfield during warm-ups as a kind of beautiful noise he had not known he was missing his whole life. He did not start. He had expected as much. The regular second baseman, a young man named Al Simons who was 24 and fast, was in the lineup. Jacob sat on the bench in his home white uniform and watched the game with the focused attention he had brought to everything for 15 years, reading each pitch, each positioning, each sequence, building a mental map of the Red Sox hitters that he might need at any moment. The Athletics lost, 5-3. He did not get in the game. He did not get in the second game either, nor the third. By the end of the first week, Jacob had appeared only in pre-game warm-ups, which was not exactly what he had told his mother when he said he was going to make the team. He kept his own counsel about this. He watched. He was ready. On Saturday morning, Roy Farrell found him in the batting cage before practice. "You've been patient," Farrell said. "I've had practice. Simons is pressing. Mac's thinking about giving him a rest Sunday. See if sitting out helps him relax. If that happens, I'll be ready," Jacob said. Farrell nodded. He watched Jacob take a few cuts. The swing was still clean, still that same compact, intelligent stroke. "You know," Farrell said, almost to himself, "I told Mac about you back in the fall. I said, there's a man who's been playing professional baseball for 15 years and has never played a day in the big leagues through no fault of his own. I said that ought to be corrected before it can't be." Jacob stopped swinging and looked at him. "That's why I got the invitation?" McCabe's finger didn't hurt. Farrell shrugged. "But yeah, Mac agreed with me. He said, if the man can still play, bring him in." He picked up a ball from the bucket. "He can still play," he said quietly. Nobody here is arguing that. Chapter 8. Sunday, April 24th. He found out at 10 o'clock Sunday morning when the lineup card went up. His name was on it fifth in the order. Second base. Jacob Landis, number 23, starting at second base against the Washington Senators. He stood in front of the lineup card for a moment, alone in the corridor, and read his own name. Then he went to the payphone in the lobby of the park and called his mother. "I'm starting today," he said. Clara Landis was quiet for a moment. "What time?" 2 o'clock. "Can you?" "I'll be there at 1, she said, and hung up. By the time Jacob emerged from the dugout for pregame warm-ups, a crowd of nearly 20,000 had settled into Shibe Park. The sky was a clean April blue, high and wide, with a breeze coming in from right field that carried the smell of hot dogs and peanuts and the particular mineral tang of the infield dirt. The light was perfect, the kind of light that seems to come from everywhere at once and makes everything it touches look just slightly more real than the rest of the world. He jogged out to second base and took his position for infield warm-ups, catching grounders and making the routine throws to first. And the whole time he was aware of the crowd, the grass, the geometry of the diamond around him, all of it, as vivid and precise as a painting he had been studying for years and had finally stepped inside. He looked up at the stands. His mother was there, behind the third base dugout, wearing her good gray coat. Beside her was his brother Eddie, who had taken the bus in from Germantown. And beside Eddie was a man Jacob did not immediately recognize, older, white-haired, wearing a brown suit. And then he realized it was Mr. Kovacs from Emerald Street, his father's old friend, who had been at every one of Jacob's childhood games and had once told him, when Jacob was 9, that he had the hands of a ball player. He tipped his cap in their direction. His mother, who never made a fuss, stood up and waved with both hands. The Senators sent a right-hander named Wes Farrell to the mound, a seasoned veteran, a legitimate major league pitcher with a heavy fastball and a curve that broke late. Jacob watched him warm up from the dugout and cataloged what he saw. The arm angle, the grip he favored on the curve, the slight hitch in his delivery when he was setting up to go inside. He had spent 15 years learning to read pitchers. Today he was finally going to use it where it counted. Chapter 9. The game itself. The first inning passed without Jacob coming to bat. He played second base with quiet authority, handling one routine grounder and cutting off a throw from the outfield with the precision of muscle memory. The Athletics went down in order against Farrell, and Jacob sat at the end of the dugout and watched the game the way he had been watching games his whole life, with complete, unsentimental attention. The Senators scored 1 in the second on a double and a sacrifice fly. The Athletics answered with 1 in the third on a walk and a 2-out single. It was that kind of game, close, efficient. The kind that turned on small decisions rather than big moments. Jacob appreciated it. He had always loved this kind of baseball more than the slugfests, the days when pitching and fielding and intelligence mattered more than raw power. He came to bat in the bottom of the fourth inning with 1 out and nobody on. The crowd stirred slightly as he walked to the plate. He was only aware of the simple, essential facts. The pitcher, 60 feet away. The catcher settling into his crouch. The umpire behind him, and the bat in his hands. A 32-inch piece of white ash that he had selected from the rack that morning, with the care of a man picking out a wedding ring. Farrell looked in for the sign. Jacob stood in and took his stance, that same compact, quiet stance he had taken in thousands of games across a decade and a half. Balanced. Still. Ready. The first pitch was a fastball away. Jacob took it for a ball. He had wanted to see the velocity, the location, confirm what he had read in the warm-ups. The second pitch was the curve, breaking down and in a strike. He had known it was coming. He had started his stride and then stopped it when the spin told him it was not right to swing. 1 and 1. Farrell came back with the fastball. This time up in the zone, and Jacob was on it, a short, level swing. Contact made in front of the plate, the ball jumping off the barrel with a sound he had been listening for since he was 15 years old. It went into the right center gap like a line drive with an argument to make, skipped once on the warning track, and rolled to the wall. By the time the right fielder reached it, Jacob was rounding first base and reading the third base coach's windmill go, and he ran. Knee protesting, lungs burning, spikes digging into the Shebe Park infield, and slid into third base with his hand finding the bag, as the throw skipped into the third baseman's glove. Safe. The umpire's arms spread wide. 20,000 people made a sound like the ocean. Jacob lay in the dirt for a half second, looking up at the April sky. Then he got up, dusted himself off, set his cap right, and put his foot on the bag. Connie Mack, in the dugout, made a small mark in his notebook. He scored on the next at-bat, a sacrifice fly to deep center that Jacob tagged on and trotted home on, beating the throw by 3 steps. The Athletics led 2-1. He allowed himself, crossing the plate, one moment of something that was not quite joy and not quite relief, but was some essential third thing that he had been carrying around for 15 years, without knowing what to call it. He shook hands in the dugout and sat down and watched the rest of the inning. His second at-bat, in the 6th, was a sharp single to left, driving in a run to make it 3-1. His fielding in the 7th saved a run. A line drive up the middle that he went hard to his right for, fully extended, backhanding it and doubling off the runner at first on a throw that surprised everyone in the park, possibly including Jacob himself. Farrell, watching from the dugout steps, said nothing. He allowed himself a single nod, which was, for Roy Farrell, the equivalent of a standing ovation. The Athletics won the game, 4-2. The final out was a routine fly ball to center, and as the center fielder caught it and the crowd began its post-game murmur, Jacob Landis stood at second base for just a moment longer than necessary and looked around at Shebe Park, at the crowd filing toward the exits, at the late afternoon sun painting the upper deck in copper and gold, at the groundskeeper already moving toward the mound with his rake. He thought about his father. He thought about that day in 1929, the two of them in the upper deck, Lefty Grove on the mound, and the whole magnificent, improbable world of baseball spread out below them. He thought about the 15 years of bus rides and rooming houses and minor league towns, and all the coaches who had told him he was good enough, and all the circumstances that had conspired against him. And this moment, this exact moment, standing on the infield of Shebe Park in an Athletics uniform, with dirt on his knees and a game on his side of the ledger, made all of it, every last mile of it, feel not like a long road to the end, but like the road itself, which had been worth taking. He tipped his cap to no one in particular and jogged off the field. Chapter 10. After. His mother was waiting outside the players' entrance with Eddie and Mr. Kovacs. She was still wearing her gray coat, and she had the particular expression on her face that Jacob recognized as the one she reserved for moments that mattered not quite a smile, not quite anything else, just the face of a woman who knew the full weight of what she was witnessing. Jacob came through the door, and she hugged him. which was unusual enough that Eddie raised his eyebrows and said nothing. "Your father would have," she started. "I know, Ma." Mr. Kovacs shook his hand with both of his and pumped it several times without speaking. His eyes were bright. Eddie said, "You still look too thin," and then grabbed him in a bear hug that nearly lifted him off his feet. In the locker room afterward, Connie Mack stopped by Jacob's locker while the room was still noisy with the sound of men who had won a game. He stood beside Jacob's locker for a moment without saying anything, and Jacob stood and waited. 3 for 4, Mack said. 2 runs scored, saved one in the 7th. "It was a good game," Jacob said. "Yes." Mack paused. He seemed to be considering something. McCabe's 8 weeks might stretch to 10, maybe 12. These things take time. He looked at Jacob directly. "You'll be here as long as you're needed. And if you keep playing like that, you'll be needed for a while." Jacob nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Mack." Mack turned to go, then stopped. "You said your father took you to see Grove pitch. What year?" 29. September. "I remember that series," Mack said quietly. He seemed for a moment to be somewhere else entirely. Then he came back. "Good baseball," he said. "That's all we're ever trying to do. Good baseball." He straightened his jacket and walked out of the locker room at his own unhurried pace. Jacob sat on the bench in front of his locker for a long time after the room had emptied out, turning his spikes over in his hands. The leather was scuffed and dirty. He thought about cleaning them and decided to wait. He liked the way the dirt of the Shibe Park infield looked on them. He thought he would let it stay for a while. Outside in the corridor, he could hear the stadium staff beginning the long process of shutting the park down for the night. Gates being locked, lights being cut, the vast organism of the ballpark going quiet one section at a time until all that was left was the field itself, dark and still under the April stars, waiting for the next game. There would be one. He was sure of it now. Jacob Landis laced up his street shoes, picked up his bag, and walked out into the Philadelphia night. Afterward, Jacob Landis played in 31 games for the Philadelphia Athletics in 1938, batting .298 with exemplary fielding. He retired at season's end, at his own choosing, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, in the city where he was born.